This episode of the Curious About Cannabis podcast is brought to you by you, our dedicated listeners and supporters. Thanks to your continued listening, sharing, and donations, we've been able to continue the show free from third-party advertisers and sponsors. So, thank you. And if you'd like to learn about other ways you can support the show, visit patreon.com/curiousaboutcannabis.
Hi, my name is Sher and I'm the co-founder and CEO of CB Therapeutics. We are at the forefront of bioengineering for products such as psilocybin, DMT, and different types of cannabinoids.
You're listening to the Curious About Cannabis podcast. Hey, everybody, this is Jason Wilson with the Curious About Cannabis podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in once again. I'm really excited to finally be back with everybody. We were on a bit of a break there as I prepared for season 2, but excited to be back and really excited to be back with this particular guest. I'm here with Sher of CB Therapeutics. They've been doing some really, really interesting work with biosynthesizing cannabinoids, as well as all sorts of tryptamine compounds, psychedelics, and stuff. So we're going to have a ton of awesome stuff to talk about. So thanks so much, Sher, for being willing to come on the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, this is very exciting. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got a fascinating story to tell of kind of how you got to where you are and where things are going. So I think this will be a really jam-packed episode. So just to start off, I'm sure you get tired of doing this, but very briefly, can you give kind of the elevator pitch for CB Therapeutics to give people a sense of what you're doing? And then I want to back up a little bit and talk about your personal story and how you got to where you are now.
Sure. So CB Therapeutics was started back in 2015, and it was by myself and my college friend, Dr. Jacob Bogan. And the whole idea behind CB Therapeutics was that we wanted to, back in the day, CBD and a lot of these cannabinoids were very expensive. So we
Yeah.
wanted to find a way to, make it cheaper, make it more accessible. So out of that, what came was, creating this biotech platform that would allow us to insert genes of any type into an organism and allow them to make a certain product. So, we started back in 2015. We started working on cannabinoids. We are one of the top 3 companies that, in terms of scaling up and production of cannabinoids using yeast today in the world. And we're also the leading company in the world for biosynthesis of tryptamine, such as psilocybin, DMT, many of their analogs or other molecules in yeast as
Mhm.
well. And lastly, we have a partnership with the Cleveland Clinic for clinical trials, which we will be commencing in 2021.
That is really awesome to hear. So it sounds like there's a ton going on, and it sounds like the wheels got spinning kind of fast. I mean, 5 years is not very much time for a startup to be making such big moves. So how I know you have a background in biochemistry and business management and all these different things. What was your journey like that got you to this point of wanting to start CB Therapeutics?
It's a very interesting it's a very interesting journey. So I remember when I was up in the Bay Area. So I used to live up in the Bay, and I was working for different companies. So I had a job at Novartis,
Hmm.
working with the FDA on different types of drugs and quality management systems with another company that I was with. And at that time, I decided I wanted to go to business school because I wanted to start this company. And everybody told me back then that you are crazy. So people were like, this is never going to work out. Cannabis is not even legal. What are you doing with your life? Like, this is complete ridiculousness. Pretty much everybody that I talked to told me the same thing. But, I figured, hey, I'll go to business school and I'll pitch this idea. And if it sticks, cool, I'll do it. And if it doesn't stick, then I'll just go into like a pharmaceutical business development type role or something just to kind of move my career forward. And to be honest with you, when I first moved to San Diego, I didn't think that this was going to stick. So, the moving into the business development for some pharmaceutical company sort of a thing seemed like the more likely situation to happen. But that's the thing about life, or the beauty of life is, you have to take risks. You have to follow your passion, and you have to do things that you want to do versus, what you think you should do. So, I mean, that's really how it happened. I mean, sometimes you don't expect things to happen, but they happen, and this is one of those things.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And it's I always my ears always kind of perk up a little bit when I hear someone talk about laboratory quality management systems, which sounds so nerdy, but that's a large part of the work that I did as well
Right,
was managing quality systems in labs and stuff. And
very
so
cool.
it's nice to meet a fellow person who understands that world because it's kind of a small one.
Absolutely. Right.
And what did that look like?
So the idea actually came about in 2011 when I was up in the Bay, and I remember back then, CBD was newly hot. People were just finding
Mhm.
out about it, and there was a few other cannabinoids that people were learning about. And I remember back then that I had a job that paid me 80 grand a year,
Mhm.
and back in 2011. And I remember even with making 80 grand a year, I don't think I could afford to buy CBD regularly, and it was kind of a weird thing. It's here's this molecule, and I make 80 grand, which is not bad as a salary for a
Mhm.
20-year-old, and I couldn't afford it. So out of that came the idea. My degree before that was in biochemistry, so I was always fascinated with biology. I was always fascinated with the idea that inside living organisms there are these small machines. I mean, how
Yep.
crazy is that? I mean, it's almost unbelievable. So I mean, that idea just was very fascinating to me, and seeing that happen, and studying it, going to lab classes, and doing things like that. And from there, it was just like a natural extension. And I mean, if you look at, like, for example, vitamin D or
Mhm.
vitamin C or any of these molecules in the world that you have today that are freely accessible to the people, you'll notice that eventually there's a shift from, or even aspirin, for example. So aspirin, it's a good example, so I'll use that. It comes from the willow bark tree
Mhm.
bark, right? And you have to extract it. The thing is, to supply the whole world of aspirin, there's not enough willow trees. So eventually, you have to shift the production from, let's say, using the natural source to something that's going to allow, a more greener, a better production methodology that was using E. coli bacteria for the production of these. So if you extend that concept to different things in the bioeconomy and the world in general, very quickly you come to realize that there's just some things are just not very efficiently made using the natural
Yeah.
production system. So that's kind of how the idea started taking hold in my mind back in 2011. And back then I had a couple different jobs. I was working previous to going to Novartis, I was working at Steep Hill as the lab director there,
Oh, nice.
the cannabis testing lab. So I kind of had a little bit of ins and out, and an understanding of what the market is about, or what people are interested in. So that's kind of how it started. And frankly, what happened was this idea became like an obsession. And I know
Mhm.
this sounds ridiculous, but I would go to work in the morning, and I would get done at 5 or 6 p.m. at my regular job, and I would come home and I would spend, instead of playing on the PlayStation, and I love video games, and I've been a gamer my whole life. I stopped doing that, and I started just reading research articles. I mean, every day I would spend 4 or 5 hours after work, just researching this idea. And even my friends and people around me were like, "What are you doing? What is this all about? This is an illegal thing." Like, back then, actually, I wasn't even a U.S. citizen. I just became a U.S. citizen about a year ago,
Oh.
so it's been a long journey for me. But it was just like there was just so many weird things about the situation. I don't have any money. I'm not a citizen. The idea is illegal. But that's the thing about things that you get fascinated about, right? It's like
Yep.
a lot of the times it doesn't make sense. A lot of the times you just are curious about it, and that's how it started. So it started with me reading maybe a few thousand research papers. I think collecting a lot of research papers in my free time, writing up a bunch of stuff like this could make this, you could do this with that,
Mhm.
and just kind of freelancing it. And back then, it wasn't even about starting a company. It wasn't even about. It was just, hey, this is an idea. This is cool. Let me see how far the rabbit hole goes.
Yeah.
And that's how it started. And then what happened was, I went I left Steep Hill, I went to Novartis, did that for about 2 years. Then I went to another company called Naturalina Brands, where I set up a brand new quality management system for the company. And at that point, I was like, okay, you know what? I think I've spent like 3 years, figuring this out or whatever, and I might as well take a shot. I might as well go to business school and figure this out. And I remember famously at that time, my dad told me, he's like, the guy who makes tea at my office has an MBA. Is that what you want to do with your life, son? So, he was obviously looking out for me and trying to give me good advice and make sure that I end up somewhere with my career. But I said, hey, let's take a shot, and I came down to San Diego, and it was very there was a startup program here called Start R. So basically, you submit your startups, and they pick like six startups every year to work on. Like they help you incorporate papers and things like that,
Hmm.
free advice. So by chance, my first quarter, I applied for that program, and to my surprise, I actually got in, which was the craziest thing because everybody around me in business school was like, "What is this all about?" Because typically when you go to business school,
Hmm.
everybody's very like suited and booted. They're all finance people, or you would never imagine somebody like with my background or would be amongst these people in that way. Obviously my background is in cannabis. I use cannabis. I always have for over a decade. So it was very interesting. And once I got into Start R, they gave us a little bit of money. They gave us some encouragement. I was like, okay, we'll see where this goes. And then from there on, we went to different competitions. We won over 50 grand in different competitions
Oh, wow.
for CB Therapeutics. Because I didn't really have any money back then. I had a little bit of savings, and so I was taking 24 units in business school, and I had a part-time job as a TA,
Hmm.
and I was doing CB Therapeutics part-time. So it was a very interesting time, and that's how it started. So second year of business school, I started another company up in the Bay Area called CB Labs, which is a cannabis testing lab like Steep Hill.
Hmm.
So by chance, when I was up in the Bay Area, I met Jacob, who's my old friend from college, and he was finishing up his PhD in bioengineering from Berkeley.
Oh, nice.
And Jacob is one of the smartest people I know, and he knows his stuff. So, we went out to a bar, and we were drinking beer, and we were like, hey, should we do this together? Like, the bio stuff, I know the cannabis stuff, and let's take a shot. And that's how CB Therapeutics was born.
That is a perfect entrepreneurial tale. And you're so right that like when you're passionate about something and it just like is eating away at your brain, like you just can't get past it. And it's been like this in my life too, that you don't necessarily see the path forward or know um
What's
where
going
things are going to lead, but you're so passionate about it, you've got to take steps forward and
Yeah,
just see. And it's amazing where things can lead when you just follow. It's like Joseph Campbell, follow your bliss,
right.
sort of thing. But that's super fascinating. And so a couple of questions, and I'm going to try not to get sidetracked because there's so much going on in my mind. I guess one thing I'll ask is, why did you focus on fungi over bacteria to biosynthesize these compounds?
Sure. So these sorts of decisions were actually my partner's decisions. So,
Hmm.
the co-founder. But from what I know, is that yeast is the most scalable organism in the planet. So,
Yeah.
we've been manipulating yeast for, millennia and millennia and whatnot. We've been making beer, all these things. That's one reason. So yeast is definitely more scalable than bacteria. Bacterial fermentation is in general. It's not, obviously it's on a case by case basis.
Right.
The second reason is, typically, it's a lot safer to work with yeast than it is to work with E. coli. Uh, so those two considerations, I think, and typically when you're looking at the types of proteins we want to express, some of them may be a lot more complex than what potentially the bacteria can handle.
Well, and that's
It is a prokaryote, so those are the types of considerations that we took into play. But I mean, this is mostly Jacob is the architect here of
yeah.
this master plan. So.
Yeah, totally. And so the first thing that you chose to focus on, and correct me if I'm wrong, was CBD, right?
So CBG. So that's the
Oh,
first
CBG.
cannabinoid
Okay.
in the pathway. So we first got CBG, then we got CBD, then we got CBC, and then we started working on the V variants like
Hmm.
TVV, CBGV, etc.
Yeah, yeah. And you, to just for everyone listening, to put it in context, your company was the first to do this with yeast, right? To
No,
to
not
biosynthesize.
So there were maybe three other companies that had done this with yeast before us, uh,
Gotcha. Okay.
specifically for cannabinoids. So there was one in Canada. There was maybe one here in the U.S. One or two others that had done this before. Um, but in tryptamines, we are the first. So, for example,
Gotcha.
in the U.S., there are two other companies that are working on tryptamines as well using biosynthesis. But they started like maybe a year after that we did.
Yeah. And I know just from being in the cannabis industry and some of the dogma that can surround some of the stuff. Have you received criticism from the cannabis industry from the context of like, oh, you're pursuing, isolated compounds? Why do you need to do this when the plant is already producing these things? And you've kind of already alluded to
Right, right,
some of the rationale with some of these things, but I know that I've encountered some of
right.
these arguments myself, so I know that you have to as well. So what are some of those criticisms you've received, and what has been your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I hear, or the most interesting one, is, oh, this is a genetically modified product or whatnot. But it's
Yeah.
like, we're not selling you the yeast. The yeast is the GMO. I mean, water is water, whether you purify it from the ocean or, wherever it is. I mean, H2O is H2O. So that's the first thing that I look at it. The second thing I hear from people is, well, there's a lot of stuff in the plants that you can't replicate with the yeast right now, which is sort of true. I mean, we typically work on a compound by compound basis. And typically, when you're looking at extractions from hemp or cannabis, there are hundreds of molecules in there, maybe in trace concentrations, but typically that's the case. So a lot of times people will say, hey, maybe this is not as effective as what is found in the plant. And there may be a case that you could make for that. But I think the biggest thing that people say is, hey, like you said, is why are you doing this? You can already do this with the plant. And there's a lot of people that don't understand the idea of sometimes why it's necessary to have isolated molecules. So
Mhm.
if you look at the structure of the FDA, I don't think that there's many medications or anything at all out there that's a mixture of different, like, it's like a whole plant extract, right?
Right.
It's typically two or three or four or five molecules that are used in a very specific way for a very specific condition. So, when I hear these arguments and I hear these for, like, for example, in psychedelics, I'm hearing this a lot. It's like, oh, these molecules are only meant to be used in a certain way. You need to have a shaman, you need to have a ritual.
Mhm.
It's like, I can see the case for that. I mean, in rudimentary settings where you don't have an understanding of medicine, you don't understand how the FDA works, you don't understand how you bring drugs to the market with proper scientific testing and procedure. So in that setting, yeah, I think you may need that sort of infrastructure to safely use a molecule like psilocybin or DMT. But I think that you know there's a reason why we have all these scientific rigors. There's a
Mhm.
reason why, the FDA doesn't have, 50 different plants that are used as an FDA approved therapy. Not to mention, I mean, even if you were to get an FDA approved, plant, for example, you would still, there's just so much variability, like, right? Like if you're
Mhm.
testing
Yeah.
the same plant, each specific plant is going to be slightly different. So these sorts of issues are completely bypassed when you have a platform which makes pure molecules. And that is exactly what we wanted to do with this.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And this is a topic that I spoke with Ethan Russo a while back, year and a half ago or so, or year ago,
Nice.
and we talked about this as well, like the practical realities of drug development in the United States, and what you just highlighted, how the FDA works, how the drug approval process works in the United States. I mean, it's one reason why we still don't have Sativex approved in the United States, because Sativex is one of these weird pharmaceuticals that is actually cannabis extract, quasi standardized to THC and CBD um, and some other minor compounds, but it is an herbal extract. And so it
Right.
just the way our systems exist, things like that are more challenging to push through, and our system doesn't quite know how to I don't know, I guess how to rigorously study it in the same way, because there's, like you said, there's so many variables at play, that how can you control everything and all that sort of stuff. And of course, other countries have other ways of tackling that sort of thing. Some countries have sort of uh, medicinal, botanical pipelines, sort of, that are sort of treated slightly different, a little more rigorously than dietary supplements, but not quite the same as pharmaceuticals. But
Right.
it's a tricky process, and so when you are just thinking about the practicalities of how to make these natural products available widely on the market,
Right.
it does often require this sort of thinking, and to get some of the research done that we would like to see as well, human clinical research and everything. It requires these, standardized, consistent
Right.
products. Yeah.
The other way I look at it is, you know, aside from CBD, if you look at some of the other cannabinoids, so let's just take another example. Let's say CBC, cannabichromene.
Yeah.
So CBC is extracted today generally from hemp or cannabis plants. And we've done some research, and what we found out is typically a kilogram of 90% CBC will sell for anywhere between 30 to fifty
Hmm.
thousand dollars a kilogram. Now, I mean, that's a lot of money, right? And you're just talking about 1 kilogram of product. And if you compare that to CBD, for example, CBD is going anywhere between 2 to 4,000, 5,000, depending on the quality. Now, if somebody's going to do research and figure out what CBC or any of these molecules are going to do, it's going to be very expensive. So, part of what, the whole goal behind the platform that we've created was to democratize access to these molecules. So, another example I'll use here is psilocybin.
Hmm.
So there's two ways that you can make psilocybin before we came into the market. The first one was obviously extraction from mushrooms. Mushrooms typically contain 0.6% psilocybin by weight on average. So if you do the math on it, it's about 100 grand a kilogram of pure psilocybin, which is a lot of money. Now, the other option is what Compass Pathways is doing, the company that recently IPO'd, that's doing the psilocybin clinical trials. They are buying synthetic psilocybin that's used with made with chemical
Hmm.
synthesis. That's about $500,000 a kilogram.
Wow. Wow. And so that leads to another question that I had about the rationale for why you've chosen to do things the way you are. I'm sure you've been hit with this question before. Why biosynthesis over traditional laboratory chemical synthesis?
So typically, when you do traditional lab chemsyn, you get racemers, or those racemic
Yes.
mixtures. And that's one problem with chemical synthesis. The other problem with chemical synthesis is the cost. So, as I mentioned, chemical synthesis is very expensive.
Hmm.
Um, the, the the leverage that you have using biology is once you program the cells to do something, they automatically make the product.
Yeah.
So typically, once you have, the hardest part is genetically engineering the strain of yeast to for it to have the ability to make this product. Once you do
Hmm.
that, then the cost is minimal. Then the cost is the cost of fermentation, the cost of sugar, which is not that much. Compare that to every single time you want to do something, you have to
Yeah.
mix up chemicals and things like that. So that's the big advantage here is you can make any molecule once you've figured out the pathway, once you've developed the yeast. It's cheap, it's easy, it's accessible, and it's green.
Yeah. 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 Those are really good points to bring up, and the idea of the isomers and side products and stuff. That's something that we're seeing in the hemp market right now. Um, some of my friends that are still working in the cannabis testing labs, that I still talk to, one thing that they're seeing now is delta 8 THC. So a lot
Right,
of people are rushing to. A lot of times they say it's hemp derived, but really they're synthesizing delta 8 THC from CBD.
right,
Um, and what the testing labs are seeing on the chromatograms when they're
mhm,
running these samples are all sorts of other peaks of mystery compounds. They don't know what they
right,
are. They assume there are
right,
various forms of THC or possibly CBD degradation products, whatever, or just totally different side products or whatever, heavy polymers in some cases. So this idea of non-target compound production and purity is definitely a problem. And obviously, you can do chemical synthesis in ways where you get extremely pure products. That's very common, but um, it's definitely a lot simpler to use an organism that's going to engineer a very targeted compound every time,
Right.
without worrying necessarily about all of these side reactions. And something you mentioned in an interview of yours that I watched in preparing for this interview is you mentioned that sometimes with the chemical synthesis, you run into problems with the enantiomers, these compounds that have the same, their same molecular formula and laid out the same, but they're essentially mirror images of each other, the left hand and the right hand. And sometimes with chemical synthesis, you don't always, depending on what analytics you're doing to
Right.
verify quality of your products, you may not actually have your right hand, you may have your left hand, or vice versa.
Right.
And I heard you mention that sometimes with the biosynthesis, it can be simpler to ensure the proper form of the molecule you're going after actually gets produced.
Yeah, so that's the other beauty of using the platform is, when typically when you do chemical synthesis, it can be tough and very difficult to control which isomer you actually end up making, and there's a lot of waste.
Yeah.
So typically, if you make 1 kilogram of any product using chemical synthesis, you have about ten kilograms of chemical waste.
Yeah.
uh, that's a huge down. With biosynthesis, the advantages are huge. Like I said, cheaper, faster, and the fact that you use the same machinery or similar machinery to what was in the original organism. So, for
Mhm.
example, the enzymes that we use in the yeast are basically derived from cannabis and hemp, but we've modified
Mhm.
them, right? So we've made them more efficient. We've made them into like super racing, enzymes. So that allows us to, better adapt to the host. In this case, that would be the yeast. But because we are using enzymes that are very similar to what's in the plant itself, essentially the molecule comes out exactly as it would in the plant, and that's one of the other beautiful things about this.
Yeah. And do you ever run into like one issue that breeders are running into with cannabis? And I had a really fascinating conversation with Kevin McKernan about this from Medicinal Genomics about essentially. Well, I guess maybe you're able to bypass this, but you have leaky genes. You have genes that code for certain enzymes, but under slightly varying environmental conditions, they might actually produce a slightly different enzyme. And it's one reason why getting a THC-free plant is challenging when you still want CBD and other cannabinoids, because it's possible for little trace, tiny amounts of THC to be produced by the genes that would normally code for the synthase enzymes, that would produce CBD. Are you able to bypass those sorts of problems through this method?
Yes. So, in the beginning, we had that sort of an issue
Hmm.
where, so you're right. The enzymes that are naturally found in the plants, if you use them as is,
Hmm.
you will have a lot of leakage, as you described. Um, part of any good genetically engineered organism is not just using the original enzymes in the way they were, because you have to remember these enzymes, the way they're found, are optimized by nature to work in
Hmm.
plants or
Yeah.
in fungi, for example, for like psilocybin and DMT and different sort of fungi. So when you port over those enzymes into a new host or a new organism, of course it's going to be very suboptimal. In
Hmm.
fact, you will probably have to change, a good 30-40% of that enzyme to be able to have the optimal functioning in that cell itself. So you know here's the funny thing. The funny thing is when you're in college and you're looking at genetic engineering courses and you look at your biology textbook, and the way they explain it, and it's just so easy. It's just like, okay, you take this,
Right.
you put it in this other organism, voila, and now you have
Right.
everything
Easy.
working. It's easy, like, it's just like, that's it, like, and there's nothing to it. But in practice, things are very different. In practice, there's a million things that go wrong. In practice, you put in one gene, something else is imbalanced. So it's almost like you're not just putting in genes and then letting the genes work. You have to optimize the whole organism. One thing may lead another thing to be out of balance. So you have to basically control, like, for example, for us to make CBD in yeast, I think we've had to, on the same yeast cell, we've had to add maybe 20 genes into the cell, and
Hmm.
we've had to remove maybe 10, 15 of them.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So for example, yeast typically makes alcohol, right?
Hmm.
If you give it sugar. So we've had to remove that functionality because if the yeast is continually making alcohol from the carbon flux or the carbon that we're
Hmm.
feeding it, then we're losing efficiency. So that's another one
Yeah.
of those things that you have to work. So the way, my realization in the last 5 years is there's a world of a difference between theory and application, and that's the big lesson here.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And a sort of funny question that I know someone listening wants to ask, I can just feel it, is is there any way to use this technology to um let's say that you didn't totally remove the yeast ability to make alcohol, and let's say it's making alcohol and whatever target cannabinoids. Could you create a process where you essentially made an alcoholic beverage that automatically produces cannabinoids as part of the brewing process?
Yes, we've had some inquiries about this. So
Yeah,
it's
well, that's why I said I know someone's thinking about this.
yeah, it's a concept that's out there, and yeah, theoretically you can do that. Again, the question really is, I haven't really made any beer like that. I mean, I tried beer making in college just as an
Hmm.
amateur, and um, yes, you could do that. I mean, however, I think it would be difficult to regulate that product, for
Yes.
example, in the current market, and that's sort of why we haven't gone through with that. But it
Yeah,
is
yeah,
totally
no, that
possible. To your question, of course, it's totally possible.
yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating thing to think about. And switching gears a little bit away from the cannabinoids, and we may come back to them, but to talk about the focus on psychedelics and um, some of your partnerships and work that you're trying to do to help supply clinical trials and that sort of thing. I wanted to make sure we spend a little bit of time talking about that.
Sure.
Um, what is it particularly about psychedelics that piqued your interest? Because you had your background in cannabis testing labs and all of that. Is it that you? I mean, because it's sort of like cannabis research. Psychedelic research is starting to snowball again, finally
Right.
picking up from where it left off in like the '60s.
Right.
But it's picking up steam, and we're starting to see FDA willingness to create a pathway for these compounds to be used therapeutically. So, um, is this something that came from looking at all of that and seeing where that's all going, or does it also stem from kind of a personal interest or any personal experience as well?
Absolutely personal experience. I
Yeah,
mean, I always like to be upfront, and some people don't like to talk about their experiences with psychedelics or things like that. I'm very open about my life and my experiences. I started using psilocybin or mushrooms. Obviously in college I did them recreationally a couple times with friends,
sure.
but in the last few years it kind of came back because I was obviously starting a company is not the easiest thing in the world, and you do have a lot of mental challenges. I've had to deal with depression over the
Mhm.
years, back and forth. So, I started using them more so recently, like once a month or once every other month, as a reset button for myself personally. And
Mhm.
because I had a lot of friends that did it, and there's a lot of evidence mounting, and it kind of works. So I actually, that's kind of how it started for me. And what's interesting is at that time, me and Jacob and some of our friends, we would always joke about it, like, "Oh, we should do this," or obviously, people talk about it, but there was never really any like serious catalyst at that time. What changed that for us was, so CB Therapeutics was also part of Y Combinator, so we were
Mhm.
in Y Combinator in 2018. So in 2019, there was a YC Bio event. So all the bio companies come in, and by chance, I met somebody there that was talking about psychedelics. And they were just standing up and they were talking about psychedelics. And I was like, wow, this guy's different. I should go talk to him. He's a
Yeah.
very interesting guy. He's not the typical YC type of person. So he's another founder. I started talking to the guy, and he seemed very interesting. And he was interested in seeing how you could make all these molecules, and obviously we had a platform. And then it happened where I invited him to San Diego. He came and stayed at my house, and
Nice.
we became friends after that and started talking about it. And then they were like, we'd be interested in having you make psilocybin for us, filing the IP, and we'll give you $4 million. We'll give you, X percentage of a joint venture, which we're going to list publicly on the Canadian Stock Exchange. And I was like, okay, I'm in. I mean, we'll do it. Uh, so that's how it started. Now, that's not how it ended. So what happened was, things didn't work out with this group in terms of the money never came. They kept leading us on, and then we started getting a little like suspicious, like maybe they know some competitors or something, and they're
Uh,
push us back. So that time we made the decision, like, hey, you know what? We can't wait for this person or this group to come back and give us the money. This is a very important project. There's a lot of steam around this, so we should just absorb the cost and we should move forward and we should be the first to file IP in the space and actually make the product in use. So that's what we ended up doing. Is we said, okay, you know what, maybe they're going to come through, maybe they're not, but we should just take the project on. We've already put some time and energy into it. So that's what started with psilocybin. Now, so we filed a patent for psilocybin in October of last year, and we made a press release about it. And the next day, I got a call from Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Brian Barnett. He's a doctor there, and he was very interested in what we were doing, and that's how it started the conversation. And 4 months later, we signed a document saying, "Hey, we would like to collaborate on Cleveland our clinical trials." And then we made DMT, we made 7, 8 of the other molecules of mushrooms. I believe we just made 5-MeO DMT, bufotenin,
mhm.
recently in yeast, and now we're working on a bunch of other molecules that are undisclosed, but you'll be hearing about them. So that's kind of how the whole thing happened. And then because we ended up being in this new space with psychedelics, it's almost like a brand new Pandora's box is open, right? I mean, cannabis itself was one, and now there's this, and it's very interesting because if you look at the time in 2019 was a very interesting year. Obviously, 2020 is an even more interesting year, but the buildup of how things have happened is very interesting. So late 2019 is when the cannabis public markets crashed, right? So before that, you had
Mhm.
huge valuations of companies, all
Oh
these
yeah.
crazy things, and then we start finding out that maybe these companies aren't going to live up to what they claim they're going to live up to. It's all just the press releases or whatever, and they're losing money. So that caused the great crash. I mean, I remember before 2019, valuations were sky high. You could write stuff on a napkin and you could probably get funding. 2019, I think, changed that a little bit. And then, so that was late 2019 when things were really terrible for the public cannabis markets. Then comes 2020 and the regular market crashes. So, it's been a very interesting journey. But what I see still is psychedelics are still very popular. In fact, the rush is starting now.
Yes.
And for cannabis, I don't think the rush is going to come back like it used to be. I
Mhm.
mean, cannabis and cannabinoids are always going to be there, like any other commodity or any other product that we have there. But that sort of intensity in growth, that sort of like craziness, is not going to come back, in my opinion. But that is happening now with these psychedelics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been fascinating to be a part of that whole um I don't know, this maturation process for an immature market. It's, just speaking to the business side of your brain, it's a fascinating thing to behold, to see a new market uh enter the space and go through these changes. We saw it with technology spaces in the 90s and early 2000s and websites and .com booms and stuff. But it is such a fascinating thing to see. Um, to see these markets find their grounding. And I agree that cannabis is now, it's maturing and investors are getting wiser. And I yeah, 2008 was definitely a big drop because my naive young mind getting out of grad school, I got wrapped up into companies that were like, oh yeah, we'll throw you stock options and everything's great and we're valued at all of this money per share, and look out 10 years from now and you're going to be just swimming in cash from how the cannabis industry is going to grow, and then all of that totally collapsed. It gave me some important life lessons because I've learned, hey, don't take stock options in a startup unless you're extremely confident that what they're going to do is going to be, you
Work
know,
out,
it's
right?
going to be, yeah, seriously work out. Um, but you're right, and yeah, the psychedelic stuff, like we now have cities that are starting to decriminalize entheogenic plants and
Right.
that sort of thing. Laws are just like with cannabis, slowly city by city, and then very soon state by state. Oregon's working on voting for therapeutic access to psilocybin mushrooms. We're going to see this domino effect play out
Right.
very similarly. Although I think it's going to be different. Psychedelics is just a different beast, but it's very similar in that buildup of energy and the snowball that's rolling and building. I'm really interested to see where it goes. And one thing I wanted to ask you, because you've talked mainly about tryptamines, so I also
Mhm.
wanted to ask you about phenethylamines. Is that something that is on your company's radar as well? And I don't mean like MDMA, but I'm thinking about other. I mean, mescaline is an interesting phenethylamine, but there's also a whole world of interesting psychedelic phenethylamines out there that are a lot of people just don't know as much about. It seems like.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we have about, I would say, about 5 or 6 other molecules that we're working on right now that are under wraps.
Hmm.
Typically, the way that we do it is we don't really disclose what we're working on until we
Sure.
file the patents on them, which is just standard practice for any company. But we have a couple in development that are phenylethylamines as well.
Cool.
Um, the challenge with these sorts of molecules, in my opinion, is the regulatory structure is just not that developed. So
Hmm.
it's a very you're almost like in the wild west. So
Yeah.
you don't really know exactly who's going to buy this. We have a DEA R&D license. We're applying for a manufacturing license. The DEA is notoriously slow. So if anybody
Yeah.
from the
Yep.
DEA is listening, they should know. It's a very slow process, and it just takes forever. And there's a lot of problems that come with regulating new molecules. And if anything, if there's one thing we need as a society is a better infrastructure to handle these types of things. Because I don't think it's
Hmm.
there. I think the general worldview is, drugs are bad, and you don't want to do anything that the doctor doesn't prescribe, and that's the end of the conversation. So I think that needs to change.
Yeah, absolutely. Just the way our culture handles substance use and drug education, all of these things. Yeah, it's something that the education work that I do is not just with adults, but also with kids, which some people are kind of like, what, you know. But it's very important to, I think, to give kids a an accurate portrayal of different drugs, and psychedelics are one of those that there's so much. I mean, with a lot of drugs, but especially psychedelics, there's so much of a mythos, all of these sort of grandiose ideas that surround them, that it can be extremely challenging to um conceptualize them, to put them in a framework that fits, especially if someone has never experienced a psychedelic at all, then they really have no framework to fit it in, because they just act very differently than a lot of other compounds that people might have tried recreationally or medicinally. So I agree. It's um, our systems, both in the drug development space, in drug education, and from like a harm reduction perspective, just around public policy. We have some evolution and growth, I think, to go through as a culture to figure out what to do with some of these products.
Absolutely, and I think what fascinates me even more of it is, for a lot of these molecules, we don't even know how they work,
Yeah.
right? We know it does something, and we can see like the final effects, but we don't really. I mean, we're just starting to figure out like how some of the mechanisms are happening, and for people to get passionate about this and to figure stuff like this out, there needs to be a more positive connotation and a positive association with these types of
Mhm.
education and ideas and things. And if that's not there, then we're not really going to be progressing that much.
Right. Yeah. I think it's important. for people in general to conceptualize these sorts of things as tools. Like
Right.
things have a place and time and an appropriate application. There are safe ways to handle them, and there are unsafe ways to handle them. And I think that's a very easy analogy for a lot of people to grasp onto, that these compounds, they're tools in a tool chest that we're still trying to understand even what some of the best applications for these tools are.
Right.
um, but we do know that there are um, pretty safe ways to interact with them if you just have some basic education.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and so I wanted to make sure I didn't miss this. So the clinical trial with Cleveland Clinic, what is that clinical trial going to focus on? Can you speak to that at all?
So we have a confidentiality agreement with them, but
Okay, sure.
I can't talk too much about it. But what I can tell you is it's going to be multiple clinical trials,
Hmm.
not just one, and they're going to be focused on 3 or 4 or 5 different conditions. So
Gotcha.
one would be treatment-resistant depression, various form, a specific form of that, PTSD, and addiction disorder. So those are
It's
the
great.
three that we're focusing on right now.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. I'll be really looking forward to seeing the results of that. And like you mentioned earlier, there's so much about your story I can personally relate to. We have some like overlapping backgrounds and things, but also in my own life, I struggle with depression, that comes and goes, that sometimes can be pretty serious. And that's something I've discovered on my own, is how
Right.
powerful psychedelics can be in treating not just depression, but also, and this is me speaking personally, not as a doctor suggesting anyone else should do this, but for myself, you know, so not just depression, but also chronic anxiety and these sort of things. It can help substantially, and I think what the interesting promise of psychedelics is particularly for mental health, based on the research that's been done, is that we may be integrating compounds into our therapeutic tool chest that only need to be used a few times, rather
Right.
than drugs that need to be taken every single day, that are changing, potentially your biochemistry, causing adverse side effects, long term, all these other things. And so it's a very interesting doorway into a almost a new it's not really new, rediscovered sort of modality, where you don't have to take a drug every day. Maybe you just need sessions, and
Right.
you take a drug every 3 months or 6 months,
Right.
and you get possibly even more profound
Right.
results.
You
Um,
know, I would say if you weren't depressed before 2020, you're definitely depressed now. So, I think it's a global phenomenon, and if you're stuck at home for a majority of the year, then yeah, everybody's going to feel depressed. Which is why I think the need for these molecules, these specific therapies, is even more so than it was last year. So
mhm.
I definitely agree that there needs to you know as a society, we've just been like conditioned to feel like, hey, you have a problem, go to the doctor, and they'll give you a one of those Pez dispensers with pills in them, and you pop one a day, and that's it. One a day keeps the doctor away, kind of a mentality. And now we're just realizing that there are new molecules that are just so powerful, like you said, that you only need to use them once every 3 months. You only need to use them once every 6 months or something, because just that one use has enough punch or power packed in that punch where it just lasts. So,
Yeah.
which is great, right? Which is you don't have to take 90 pills. You just take one session and you're good. So that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and if anyone listening isn't aware, another common benefit to psychedelics as a therapeutic agent is, generally they're hard to abuse. They sort of have built-in anti-abuse mechanisms, because the experiences sometimes can be so profound,
Right.
so sort of ground shaking for people, that they often don't want to do it again very soon, or very often at all. Obviously there are exceptions to that,
Right.
but that's another thing that has researchers really that's really piqued their interest in these compounds, is that, oh, you can elicit this very, very strong effect, and it's not necessarily enjoyable. It can be beneficial on
Right.
a very high level, but it's not always necessarily pleasurable, from a sensual sort of perspective or something. So
Right.
it's yeah, abusing psychedelics is a little tougher than other things. And one thing that I wanted to ask, and this is sort of on the technical side, but do you find that in using yeast to biosynthesize psychedelics, is it easier to focus on these smaller, simpler molecules like psilocybin, like DMT, that are very similar to serotonin, roughly, not super large compounds, versus something like LSD, which is a more complex molecule, bigger? And this is from my own ignorance because I haven't studied the biosynthetic pathways that produce compounds like that, or like LSA or anything like that. So is it more challenging at all to get a yeast to produce more complicated, just from a molecular standpoint, something like LSD than it is a simpler compound like psilocybin or DMT?
Typically, you're right. Like, typically, the more complex a molecule is, the harder it's going to be to make it, just like it would be with chemical synthesis.
Hmm.
But in the so for example, in chemical synthesis, like let's say you already know how hard it's going to be based on looking at the structure, right? So okay, this
Sure.
molecule has 50 atoms and et cetera, et cetera. You can have a very good idea in your mind of how it's going to work out, right? Or how
Hmm.
complex it might be. In bio, I think it's a little different, and it's a little different because it's a lot more unpredictable. Um, you may find genetics or genes from an organism that may be really good. So even if the molecule is more complex, you don't really have to do much. The enzymes or the genetic machinery just does its own thing. Uh, Alternatively, you may come across a molecule that's not that big, that may be more problematic. So
Hmm.
it's a little more unpredictable, unfortunately. There.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense, and then that's why it takes so long in method development, whether it's
Right.
in biosynthetic chemistry or analytical chemistry or whatever. Method development is always important, always takes a while to fine tune those details. So yeah, that was something that just popped in my mind, that I didn't know if that was an issue. Um, well, I see we're getting close to the hour mark here, so I want to start looping things around and wrapping things up.
Sure.
Um, can you I know, obviously you can't speak in details, and I know you're working on all sorts of other compounds you'll be talking about soon, but is there anything else, looking into the, let's say, the 10-year future for CB Therapeutics?
Mm.
um what do you, and obviously the way our paths go can lead you astray from your goals, but what do you see for the 10-year future for CB Therapeutics?
Wow, 10 years.
That's a big one. Yeah, I know. You can start with 5 if you like, and then we can speculate after that.
Yeah, I mean, so okay, I will start with five because I think that's a little more. I could probably talk a little bit more about that easier. So in 5 years, I think um, where CB Therapeutics will be is we will have maybe some drugs that are about to be FDA approved.
Mhm.
In 5 years, I think maybe we'll have 2 or 3 clinical trials that will be in phase three, getting close to finishing the trial. Um, I see us where, today, for example, we have 12 cannabinoids that we've made in yeast. We have 8 terpenes that we've made in yeast, and we have about 13 or 14 tryptamines that we've made in yeast. I see in 5 years that we're probably going to cross the 500 or 1,000 molecule mark.
Mhm.
So as time goes forward, you become better and better at what you do. And
Yeah.
back when we started 4 years ago, we were nearly not as good as where we are today. And obviously, we've had over the years we've brought on some excellent staff. We have 18 full-time staff at CB Therapeutics. We have 9 PhDs with 7 to 10 years of experience. So with time and with bringing on new talent, you get better and better. I think the future. I think of synthetic biology with these molecules is not in making one molecule; it's in making libraries of these. So, for example, if I have psilocybin, now I can make 60 analogs of psilocybin. Now,
Yeah.
those are interesting because now I can play around with some of the properties. Like I can find the molecule that has similar benefits, but it may only last 10 minutes versus, let's say, 5 hours. So, so right now there's a land grab happening in the tryptamine space, just like how there was in cannabis 10 years
Mm.
ago, right? Everybody is filing patents. Everybody is trying to make new molecules. I know of maybe 4 or 5 companies in the tryptamine space that are using chemical synthesis. Every 2 weeks, they're making a new molecule. They're, figuring out the crystal structure. They're filing a patent on it. So in 5 years from now, I see a few clinical trials. I see our compound library over 1,000 molecules, maybe even more, depending on how things are going to work out. And of course, with the, with technology, things are going to get easier. Um, we have we have one patent granted on a bioinformatics platform that we use
Oh,
for
cool.
genetic and data manipulation and all sorts of analyses in silico. So we have another patent which is about to be granted on that as well. So using that in conjunction with ultra modern cutting edge technologies and techniques that we will be able to, for example, purchase in the future once we have more funding, will I think allow us to probably even cross that 1,000 molecule mark. And then from there, the idea is to find partners that want
Mhm.
to use some of those molecules. Us as CB Therapeutics, we will never be able to use, or any company, in my opinion, will be able to use the full 1,000 molecules, right? It's
Yeah.
just not possible. So, we're creating it and then we want to give it out, like in the sense of we want somebody else to take the reins from there and make something amazing out of it. So that's where I see
Yeah.
CB is going.
Well, that's really cool because that's very much kind of an Alexander Shulgin sort of perspective there, that you're building the tools and opening up the work shed, so to speak, for people to take those and figure out what they can do with them, what they can learn from them, and continue this ever building body of knowledge and wisdom, um, not just around these chemicals but also how the body works. How,
Right.
one thing that's interesting about psychedelics is what can they tell us about the mind body connection, and just the concept of what is consciousness and how does the brain influence it, all these sort of things. How does consciousness emerge? There are all of these sort of higher level philosophical questions that these tools can give us ways to explore. Now, whether they'll give us answers or not, that's a totally different
Right.
situation. But at least to have the ability to march into these new territories,
Right.
it's cool. You're laying a foundation for pioneers that we've never heard of yet,
Right.
to come through and discover some amazing things. So,
Yeah,
um,
the way I look at it is, if there's not a cheap, accessible platform that can produce different types of molecules, those nothing is going to come out of it because it's just, we're wasting a lot of potential. So,
yeah,
for the way I look at it is, for us to provide 1,000 different molecules, let's say in 5 or 10 years from now, to different people and whatever application they might do, I think that's going to open a lot of doors, like you said, in terms of new possibilities. So if that doesn't exist, then medicine is not it's not going to advance the same
yeah,
way. And I think that's one of the things that is very interesting about, and what I love about what I do is, I mean, obviously we're a startup, we're a business, where obviously as a company you have to make money, you have to
mhm,
raise money, you have to sell product, you have to get revenue. But I think, it's also another awesome thing when you feel like you're actually doing something meaningful. So, again, one is that, we're making molecules. I do get the argument from people that, hey, this is not natural. Why don't you have a shaman with you? And why aren't you just, sitting in a drum circle with doing these molecules? And respectfully, I mean, I've been in drum circles, I've done all that, but I
mhm,
respectfully disagree with that because I feel like there's a difference between taking these molecules semi-recreationally, like these situations call for, and then there's another thing which is making medicine out of it, real medicine. Like when you're taking real medicine, you don't have a shaman blessing it. I mean, just to be
mhm,
real about it, right? I mean, it has
yeah,
to go through a very rigorous process, which has nothing to do with any of these things. So from that perspective, I think I'm uniquely blessed to be in this position where I can make a difference in that way. Is getting scientific stuff done. Getting
yeah,
getting this in front of the FDA, and I think in the future that is that will be the future of psychedelics as well.
Hmm.
You know, cannabis was the same way, right? Cannabis used to be, something that people did. Now you have FDA approved medications coming out. And I think with psychedelics, it's going to be even more so the case because I don't think there's going to be a very big recreational market for tryptamines, just
Hmm.
because the abuse potential, or if somebody does psilocybin and then they get in a car, I mean, anything can happen, right? So I think for tryptamine, it's definitely going to open a new era. I think for mental health and other conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple of things you said that I want to point out before we finish here that I think is just particularly important to note. Once again, similar backgrounds here. Myself as well. Like I've been through all of the, I don't know, the ritual around psychedelics. I've been
Right.
in that world. That's I spent a nice chunk of my life in my 20s, really exploring all of that. Um, and I think sometimes people in the industry forget that people like yourself or myself that are working professionally in these industries with natural products and things, um, that if we're talking about things that maybe they're not so comfortable with or don't have a framework to understand, why we're, you know, trying to find avenues and homes for these ideas. Um, I think it's important to know that like we're not just like suits that have come along and know that people like psychedelics or cannabinoids or whatever, and so we push those out. But there, I think about people like, so for instance, my father, who has PTSD
Right.
and several other issues, anxiety issues and stuff. I think about someone like him that could really really benefit from psychedelics, and he actually is. He's right now at least has access to legal ketamine and
Hmm.
has ketamine sessions and stuff, which has been really fascinating. That I want to talk about on a podcast episode one day. Um, but for someone like him, I mean, this is a guy. He's an old Baptist preacher from Mississippi.
Right.
Like he's not going to be taking mushrooms. He's not going to be making ayahuasca and going through an ayahuasca session.
Right.
But what he will do is in a safe, controlled setting, he will engage a psychedelic experience. I think if the right setting were presented to him, where they were like, you can take psilocybin and, we've got these controls in place. You'll be monitored. You're safe, all these sort of things. I think he would be very open to that because he knows um, how these compounds can affect mental health and how profound they can actually, those effects can be. And so this is also about opening the potential benefits of these things that, have been used traditionally in other cultures in a more, sometimes a more ceremonial, ritualistic aspect and everything with the original natural products. Well, taking them down this route, it opens up that potential benefit to a whole host of people. I mean, hundreds of millions of people, billions of people that wouldn't ever go, to some of the environments that you and I have been in and seen, how those compounds have been used. So I just think that's really, really important to note because sometimes people get really, and like I said, particularly in the cannabis and psychedelic spaces, there's just some people that are extremely passionate, which I appreciate,
Right.
but that sometimes really don't want to tolerate any space for isolated compounds, formal pharmaceuticals and stuff. And I just try to make it a point when I can to highlight that, for some people maybe that's fine, but for a lot of other people, this is needed.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I think one thing that everybody should remember, like you said, is if you are doing psychedelics, you should be tolerant of other people and their views. So I find it interesting that people that are, doing all this talking about self heal and progression and tolerance, and then they're not tolerant. So it's a very
Yes.
interesting, and I think it stems from the idea that they feel that their business is somehow threatened. So if you look at a lot of these businesses, they have built their practice on this sort of ideology, which is fine. And I think there's a place for that. There's a place for that
Hmm.
in society. And when somebody like me comes along, I think they feel a little threatened that, this guy might change the business as I know it, or whatever it may be. So I understand where they're coming from. But, the way I look at it is, the way that you use psychedelics in the traditional or the tribal sense will never be an FDA approved therapy. If
Right.
you're trying to help people and get this out to the masses out here, not in the jungle, then this is how it has to be. Like there is no other way. I mean, you can't change how the FDA regulates products. So you have to fit in the mold that the FDA has created. So that's how I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you pointed out early on in the conversation, it's also a wildlife conservation issue too. And
Right.
we can't forget that, it's like, okay, you love cannabis, you love psychedelic. Well, cannabis is a exception because it's such a big agricultural commodity, but psychedelics particularly, you love it. You want everybody to, be exposed and all this sort of stuff, but we can't be ripping the bark off of all these trees from the jungle to make ayahuasca. We can't, you know, there's just so many elements to this that we also have to be sensitive to, as well, that the work that you're doing is really helping to address. If we can find more ecologically conscious ways of producing these chemicals with
Right.
less waste, that is more efficient and more pure,
Right.
and that's something that we have to very seriously consider and adopt in its right context.
I completely agree.
Yeah. Well, awesome. I know I've kept you a little bit over, but this has been a fascinating and awesome conversation, as I knew it would. Thanks so much for being willing to come on, and I want to give you a few moments here. Feel free to plug anything you want. Let people know how to learn more about CB Therapeutics. Your website, any if you have any social media presences or anything like that. The floor is now yours to share with our listeners anything you like.
Thank you. I mean, honestly, I didn't really know what to expect coming in here, but I can honestly say that this has probably been one of the best conversations I've had in a while. I don't feel like
Oh,
we're
thank you.
recording anything. We're just hanging out and we're just having a chat. So yeah, it's my pleasure. And again, thank you so much for bringing me here. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a self-promoting type of person in that way where I mean, I think people know what CB Therapeutics is. You can definitely check us out online or the website. In terms of my parting message would be that it's a very exciting industry to be in. It's a very exciting place to be in where you can create these sorts of things. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the future. I mean, I can't wait to see what's going to happen in the next 2 years, the 3 years, the 4 years, and more so, even so, about more than my own company. I'm excited to see what the future holds for the space in general, and for helping people that have these sorts of serious issues. So people that have depression and PTSD. I hope we figure out a way where we can solve these people's problems, because ultimately that's what this whole thing is all about, right? So
Yeah.
that's my last word.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's perfect. Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, everyone listening, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad to once again be at these interviews and be bringing these conversations to you. If you want to learn more about Curious About Cannabis, and for those of you that have listened all the way through this interview, I'll give you a little preview. There's actually a new project I'm working on where this conversation will fit perfectly, but it's called Serious About Psychedelics. So, curious about cannabis, serious about psychedelics, a little theme. But more and more, a lot of the people that I'm talking to that are working in the cannabis space are also, doing some work in the psychedelic space too. So sometime next year, you're going to see a new podcast rollout that's going to focus particularly on psychedelics and the emergent space there. So those of you that have listened this long, you get that little sneak peek there. If you want to learn more about us, go to cacpodcast.com. You can also find us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Instagram's usually the best place to connect with us on social media. And yeah, thanks for tuning in. Stay curious and take it easy. Bye-bye. If you want to learn more about cannabis, check out the Curious About Cannabis book on Amazon.com and other major online book retailers. To support the show and get access to an exclusive members-only podcast feed, access to private events, merchandise discounts, and more, visit www.patreon.com/curiousaboutcannabis.